Thank you. This is going to be a blast. I am Drew Skwiers-Koballa, Program Manager at Microsoft, and those two links there are the documentation for SQL projects, as well as a code repository that has examples kind of across this whole presentation. There's a lot of content when you talk about development with Microsoft SQL, whether it's SQL Server or Azure SQL. So full disclosure, this last item, we don't have time to cover for it. But if you are a developer and you're intrigued by developing with SQL Server containers, check out that repository because there's some really cool stuff you can do. We're going to focus our time on SQL projects and how that works within Azure Data Studio. Before I can dive into SQL projects, though, I need to kind of talk for a moment about why do SQL projects matter? Why can't you just write SQL code and call it a day? And that comes down to the artifacts that we need, the master files that are required for deploying database changes. As a developer, as many of you are, you've got a kind of a familiar development pathway. You write the code, whether it's in VS Code or Visual Studio or completely different IDE, and then that code is compiled, it's validated, you're likely writing tests, there are code reviews, and then finally, that code is deployed. This process repeats for different features and bug fixes. They do happen, but it's fairly universal. Things get interesting when you talk about databases. The complication with databases is that instead of just being code, instead of just being create table statements, create stored procedure, you have data. That database that's a part of your application has a state associated with it. And so data tier application artifacts, the two primary ones, a DAC pack and a backpack, help us kind of keep that under control. The DAC pack is just the schema, just those objects. So if you have a really large database with a bunch of data in it, the DAC pack itself is going to be quite a bit smaller because it's just the schema. It could be thousands of tables still, but the data is not included. The backpack, however, is a snapshot of the entire database, including the data. So let's tie this back into that development process, that pathway. Declarative database development takes those data tier application artifacts and integrates them by having us develop for databases by focusing on what do we want the database to look like? What's that end state? So you've already created a table. You do not have to worry about writing an alter table statement. It's just you write the create table statement for the table that you want. This is also called state-based development because it's just a final state. The tooling that you use has to manage the change or the migration during deployment. So you develop with T-SQL or with a table designer that spits out that T-SQL for you. Then the tooling builds it into a DAC pack file. So not unlike you would build and compile a project in .NET, that DAC pack is built. And then finally, the tools that you use then take that DAC pack and update the database's state to match that schema. And the DAC pack file is what we need. At a really fundamental level, there's a command line tool that works with these data tier artifacts, and that's SQL package. It's cross-platform and available whether or not you're on Windows or Linux or Mac OS. So this is a really popular tool to use in like DevOps pipelines because it allows us to work with data tier application files. And so I was talking about the publish operation. That's that incremental change that updates an existing database or creates a new one with the schema from the DAC pack that you've created in your development. And that could be to a SQL server, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, or to Azure SQL in one of those databases. But SQL package is quite versatile and very functional in that has operations for backpacks and DAC packs. So if you are needing to orchestrate data application movement, then that's when you've got the tool for SQL package in terms of scripting this thing out. The syntax for SQL package is straightforward, but it's great to understand the one variable you want to watch for is the action, because that determines whether or not you're doing extract or publish or import or export or one of the others. And then from there are different parameters and properties, lots of them, that allow you to fine tune that process. I see a couple of questions in the chat. Is there active updates to SQL package? Absolutely. SQL package gets updated roughly quarterly. There is active development to it. I would say you can expect to see an update to it within a month and a half now. And then a question from Paul on deploying file stream and memory optimized structures. Paul, I do not know that off the top of my head, but I am making a mental note and I'm going to see if I can find that out and reach out and get back to you. So we've got SQL patches that allows us to work with these data tier artifacts. Over the last, I would say, year and a half, 2 years, there's been more frequent updates to it. There was a period of time where there was a lot of work happening under the covers. And what that work was bringing it to .NET Core so that it could be cross-platform. And why do we care that it's cross-platform? Because the fundamentals within SQL package work with database projects, which we've known and loved in SQL Server data tools in Visual Studio for years now. If you're using Visual Studio 2019, it's the data platform workload. And that gives you this declarative database lifecycle for your database applications. Back in September of 2020, we added the SQL Database Projects extension to Azure Data Studio. This means that if you are on Windows or Mac OS or Linux, you can use Azure Data Studio, free, open source, and work with SQL projects. It's going to use the .NET Core SDK to handle the build operations right there in the UI, and as well as that .NET Core SQL package. So we have that now available, and slideshows are fun and all, but I want to go ahead and dive right into working with database projects in Azure Data Studio. We're going to take a look at an example where you can create projects either from scratch, or you can grab an existing database and work with that. So we'll do that. We're going to make some changes to our database. We're going to be able to build it, look at what the deployment process looks like. We're going to use some functionality from database projects known as post-deployment scripts. A post-deployment script gives you the opportunity to run additional T-SQL following the original deployment to do things like modifying additional permissions or inserting some static data. There are two other extensions in Azure Data Studio that are really complementary to database projects. The first is the data tier application wizard that gives you a UI on top of SQL package. And the second is schema compare, which allows you to look at the file differences between databases, between DAC packs, between a DAC pack and a database. And we'll just take a look at that as well. So let's have some fun. I am switching over into Azure Data Studio. And I have a database. It's an AdventureWorks 2019 in Azure SQL. Since I've installed the SQL Database Projects extension, I have the projects pane. But even from within the Object Explorer, I can grab a database and say, I need to create a project from the database. And it's going to give me the options of the server and the database, but it's also asking me where I want to put it. These are going to be all the scripts that define the schema, the tables, the procedures of this database. So I've got a folder for this, and you can have it pre-organize the files for you. I am going to just do straight up object type and hit create. So Azure Data Studio is running a process in the background to grab the scripts for all the tables and the views, and it's going to pop us into the projects pane to basically open up this SQL project. I missed a really important point when I was talking about Visual Studio earlier. The current SQL projects in Visual Studio, you're already working in them. That's fantastic, but you want to give Azure Data Studio a try. They're compatible. So if you are collaborating with others and using different applications, there's cross-compatibility there as well. We have our project. We've got the tables and the functions. So for example, we've got a customer table here. This is the customer table definition from the database that I just grabbed out. Now, we've got our scripts. That's great. But let's take a look at some of the functionality of the what now. If you are ready to build your changes, let's say we want a DAC pack from this, we'd hit build. When we're ready to publish this out, let's say that we don't have a pipeline that publishes our DAC pack for us. We've got permissions. We can do that directly from here, as well as a tie-in directly to schema compare. You can be adding additional objects, including a post and pre-deployment scripts, as well as some ways to get a little bit under the covers. Changing the target platform, for example, allows us to say, I've exported a database from SQL Server 2014, but I'm ready to deploy this onto SQL Server 2019. Or perhaps you've exported it from 2014 and you'd like to use some of the functionality added in SQL Server 2019. When you do the build process, it's going to validate the code that you've used against that engine. So if you're using things that are only available in SQL Server 2019, you're going to need to make sure that your target platform matches that feature set. For those of you that I mentioned already work with SQL projects quite a bit, you do have direct access to edit the SQL project file if you want to get really hands-on. The schema compare is the most complementary other extension, and database projects will prompt you to work with it. The other one is the SQL Server DAC extension. And this gives you a nice wizard interface on top of SQL package. So if you're not a fan of command line, or for some simple operations you'd like to be able to go through the wizard, I do highly recommend this extension. But let's work with our project here. I am going to add a column to our customer table just for our rewards account ID. And I'll make that. And I've saved the file, but this has effectively added a column. When I build, it's going to go ahead and use the .NET SDK here, and it's going to build a DAC pack. When I stored the project on my local machine, it's going to build and place the DAC pack in a similar folder in there. So if you're interested in manually grabbing that DAC pack, it has built successfully, and the DAC pack is available in the folder there. But everything that we're doing within Azure Data Studio does not require us to manually grab that. I could do a schema compare now. Let's say I don't remember all of the changes that I've made, and I want to see kind of the difference between the current project, that DAC pack, and a live database. So we'll select a target of a database, and I'll use the database that I pulled this project out of. Before I hit compare, I do want to make sure that I highlight these options. You could have a lot of changes potentially when you're doing a schema compare. So it's nice to be able to filter out or exclude specific objects, or whether you're looking at other options. There's some good ones down here. White space. White space changes, if you want to be able to ignore those, you can make sure that that's checked. But when I hit compare, that's fantastic. We are live. I'm going to give it another go. 1 second. Yep. So comparing to a database, if I hit compare, okay, that's failing. That's okay. So when I do that schema comparison, it gives us this view where you can see the difference between things that have changed. In this example, a secondary phone number column has been added in the project, which is on the left, and on the right, where the live database is, that secondary phone number is not there. If you use source control frequently, this is not a new concept to you. So let's take a look at not only were we able to kind of just modify the schema flat out, but I mentioned earlier those post-deployment scripts. We can add all kinds of new tables, but I wanted to focus on a post-deployment script because it allows us to kind of break out of the mold as we need. So I'm going to say add test customer is my post-deployment script name. And this adds us a extra SQL file into our project. And if I grab some text real quick, I have an insert statement that allows us to add a customer row with my name and a sample password. So if I save this, and let's go ahead and publish it. So I'm going to publish to AdventureWorks. Before I do that, I want to look at one thing. If I select top 1000 from the customer table, looks like my database disconnected. That's okay. We have databases aplenty. Let's take a look at a different server. When in doubt, reboot, except for not all the way when you're in the middle of a presentation. I've reopened Azure Data Studio, and so it's reconnecting to a couple databases. It's going to remember the workspace that I had open. You can combine multiple SQL projects into a single workspace in Azure Data Studio. If you're familiar with Visual Studio, you can combine multiple projects into a solution. That same idea applies to the workspace concept in Azure Data Studio. So when I closed out of impatient irritation and reopened, it remembered that workspace, reopened the workspace, and reloaded that project for us. Looks like my database is back. So we're going to go ahead and connect and run this query. What I wanted to point out is that we don't have a column for rewards account ID in the table. So we're missing that element of the schema that's in our project. Let's also check to see if I'm in here already. I am. I am no longer. We're going to publish our project. When we publish our project, we should expect that the changes that we've made to the schema, namely, we should have a rewards account ID column. We should expect to see this, as well as we have a post-deployment script that should run and do some changes. So we can even have it insert one for me and then two for Louis back there who's sleeping. We'll save that. So I'm going to publish our project. We're going to check out the result of that. Before I hit publish, I mentioned earlier that we have to let the tools handle that differential between the states of the database. There's an element of trust there, and there's also the expression trust but verify. That's what Generate script is great for. The ability to generate the scripts, whether in Azure Data Studio or through SQL package, there are options to do this. We can spit out the scripts that will be applied to publish. So we can inspect those manually and make sure we're okay with the changes. You can assess the risk of the changes. You can decide what kind of impact they might have on production downtime, if it's going to be seconds or minutes, that kind of thing. If I scroll all the way to the bottom, we can see our post-deployment scripts. I trust. I've mostly verified. I'm going to go through with the publish. So we are publishing the project right now. And there's our deployment operation. It should take a few seconds. I'm checking for a few comments. Cool. So we've got our deck pack deployed. When I run select top 100 from sales.customer, I should see a rewards account ID. It's empty. We just changed the schema. We didn't do that. I check for the data added by our post-deployment script. It's there as well. So this gives us kind of the full picture of what happened after the deployment, as well as during the deployment where we got that rewards account ID. So from this SQL project, you have the ability to work with whether it's a create procedure to write procedures. You don't need to worry about create or alter. You write create, and the publish process handles determining whether or not that procedure is already there. So let me make sure I'm not missing anything. So what we have done with our project is that we were able to create a new project by extracting that from a database. We were able to edit it. We did some basic editing, but I'll go back in a minute and show a few tips that I have for kind of working and editing in Azure Data Studio. You're able to build the project right from within Azure Data Studio, and then you're able to publish that project. Some frequent questions that I get come around, can I build from the command line? SQL package does the extract and publish operation, but what about build? That's a very reasonable question. And for that, if you go to aka.ms, let me grab the full. aka.ms/Azure Data Studio SQL projects. This is the full documentation, but the nugget that I often lead people to is being able to build a project from the command line. After you've built in Azure Data Studio once, some files are placed in your user directory that can be used to then build projects from the command line. So that's one item that I wanted to make sure that you knew about as a frequent question. The other thing about editing in Azure Data Studio that comes up pretty frequently is I was doing some, I will say, low intensity changes. I was adding a column. I wasn't creating a new table from scratch, that kind of thing. But if I say want to add a table, and we're going to call this test table, it gives me a really basic framework. Let's say I want to create an index and the syntax for that escapes me. There are snippets included in Azure Data Studio. So if you start typing SQL, IntelliSense is going to suggest for you some of those snippets, whether they're create index or use a cursor. So if I do SQL index, I'm going to do create index, and this will allow me to define an index a little bit easier than trying to remember the syntax completely from scratch. So that gives us kind of an overview of editing in Azure Data Studio. Azure Data Studio is a great application for kind of a broad set of functionality with SQL Server and Azure SQL. It's gaining new functionality at the time. I swear every single time I see folks' presentations, I see things that we've shipped that I missed because there's so much being added all the time. But for a lot of people, especially developers, they're working in VS Code in their projects, and there is development functionality in VS Code. SQL projects in this form are not there yet, but because Bob Ward talked about SQL containers a bit earlier, I did, since we have a minute, wanted to take a quick detour over to VS Code and talk about container-based development. SQL database projects in Azure Data Studio are continuing to get new functionality. So please, if you have feature requests, drop them on the repo or vote on the ones that are already there. Same thing goes for VS Code and the MS SQL extension for VS Code. It's used for connecting and querying database servers. It has a lot of functionality like the query history. I mentioned that I'm taking this detour because of MS SQL containers, especially as a tool for development. I'm not going to go to bat for them as production tools in this session. Bob's got that covered. But as a development tool, I want to show you something pretty cool. There's something called remote container-based development in VS Code. What that means is that VS Code sets up a container for itself on your local desktop, on your Docker desktop, called the app container. And it connects to that and it runs it processing that. What we can do because of MS SQL containers is really quickly set up SQL Server environments for our development instead of either having to be on a Windows box and or installing a SQL Server locally. We can create that as a part of that development environment. So it becomes a lot more reusable and faster to spin up and spin down. You're no longer worrying about managing containers independently. It becomes a part of developing in VS Code. On top of that, as you automate these development environments, tools like SQL Package can be used. So, bearing with me for a moment, let's say you have a development environment you're trying to build a .NET Core app. You're C# developers, many of you, not a far-fetched prospect. If you already have a DAC pack built and you put it as a part of your development environment, SQL package can be used to do that DAC pack deployment as the dev environment spins up. That's the prospect that's in the repository for SQL development I'll show you in a minute. The other side of this coin is that remote development in VS Code is the GitHub Codespaces environment. So yes, what I'm telling you is that not even on your local machine, but in the browser, you can spin up that remote development environment with a SQL server in there with you. It's kind of like the moment when they're like, they're in the house with you on horror films. Yeah, the SQL server is right there with you. So as you look at a dev container setup, you would have a part of a Docker Compose add an additional image. So that's the SQL Server latest. And you can set those environment variables that we saw earlier, including accepting the EULA and setting an SA password. I know that's the worst SA password in the world. Bear with me. The other part about automating your development environment that's so important is that you can set up VS Code to be ready for you. And I'm going to demo this here in a second. But you can say, I want these extensions. I need the C# extension, and I need the MS SQL extension. So I can build my .NET Core app, and I can run queries against my development server. You're set. You probably have other extensions that you want, and you can add them to that array there. You can set up the MS SQL extension going into your container. So I can say, I want my local host container. This is the SA password I sent, and it's ready to go. So this instance of VS Code, it has that Docker Compose that not only has the app file, but the database file. This is already completely set up for me. That seems too easy. I know Bob said that he challenged someone to get set up with SQL Server development on a Mac in 5 minutes, and they did it in 3. Let's see how we do. I'm in VS Code. The only thing that I need to make sure that I have, besides Docker on my computer, is the remote containers extension. I am going to add development container files. I have to open a folder first. Let's open a folder. So I've got a folder. It's opening. And then it's going to ask me what dev container do I want to add? I search for SQL. There's a C# .NET and MS SQL definition. Huh, look at that. It's going to bring in a kind of bare bones setup for us. You can learn more about it at the link right here. But VS Code says, wait a minute, I see a dev container definition. Do you want me to spin up that container and reopen? So I'm going to hit reopen. VS Code is going to handle the Docker pull for the SQL Server. It's going to reopen itself in that app environment with .NET Core so I can do my app development. VS Code is going to install the MS SQL extension for me because it knows that it's this really amazing tool. And then we'll be able to use the MS SQL extension to connect to our container. So we have two complementary applications. We've got Azure Data Studio, where we can do kind of focused SQL project development. We can build those SQL projects into our DAC pack, our data tier application files. And then we also have VS Code, which is complementary, a development environment where we have got some really essential SQL tools that we can tie right into modern development concepts like containers. So VS Code is starting the container and it's opening the remote. And while I give it a moment to do that, this repo right here, github.com/daisy_SQL development tools, has info about database projects in Azure Data Studio, and it has information about the dev containers in VS Code. We definitely don't have time to go this far down the road, but I can tell you that if you fork that SQL development tools repository and you open in code spaces, you can get that same VS Code development environment right in your browser. So this is the code spaces version, whereas my dev container is installing the extensions, opening the remote, connecting. Still got my dev container definition. I'm in the remote now. It's installed the MS SQL extension. It's going to grab the tools service, and then it's going to have that connection pre-populated for us. When we look at database development, I started at the beginning and I said, there's kind of a hitch to database development. We have to keep in mind that there's a database state. But with the proper tools, you can still use the same development cycles that you use for building C# applications. So I do suggest that you check out the database projects extension in Azure Data Studio, especially if you're using SSDT, because they can be really complementary experiences, especially if you're collaborating with other people. Different people may be using different tools. And then with container-based development, you get a really reusable environment. So in this example, we've got this MS SQL container where we can create databases. And in the example in that GitHub repo, there is a script that runs as the container launches that looks for DAC pack files and then publishes them in the container when the container spins up. So instead of hopping into this empty environment, you can throw a DAC pack in there and hop into your app's database and get right to work with your C# code or your Node.js code or whatever you truly care about. I have some follow-up to do with Paul on a question about memory optimized objects. You all are welcome to reach out to me either via email or on Twitter. And here are some resources to help you go after some of the cool tools that we looked at. Thanks for joining me today. That's all I have.